All the missiles have been pre-armed. Special weapons block indicator.
Indicate unlock.
RCD.
8 years after the Wright brothers first flew, an airplane dropped a bomb.
15 seconds to release. Radar's on his offset. 10. 9,
Within 40 years, an aircraft could destroy a city.
2, 1. Missile away.
Now, it can lay waste a country. This awesome airplane is the American B-52. B for bomber. The 52nd since the United States commissioned its first in World War I. It is the deadliest aircraft in history. It can carry 40 tons of conventional bombs or a 15-megaton nuclear device. It can circle the Earth. It is the supreme embodiment of air power. The strategic bomber. Bombers have brought a new and horrific dimension to warfare, annihilating people, demolishing cities, obliterating landscapes. Conventional bombing reached its climax in the war in Vietnam. In a 10-year campaign, the United States dropped over 6.5 million tons of bombs, more than was used in the whole of World War II. Every type of bomb was used. Every type of bomber flown. The fighter bomber, called up by radio in support of the troops on the ground and dropping its napalm just yards away from its own GIs. The medium-range bomber, sent in to destroy the enemy's communications and supply lines, using the pinpoint accuracy of laser-guided bombs to hit its targets. Most terrible of all, the strategic bomber, the B-52 itself. Summoned from thousands of miles away, it rained destruction on economic targets deep in the heartland of North Vietnam. The effect of such bombing on its victims was shattering.
We had surrendered to us an NVA soldier. We hadn't been standing there watching him in the trench more than a couple of minutes before one of our own jet aircraft flew over at some distance from the hill. Whereupon this man literally dissolved into shaking and uncontrolled reaction to just the sound of that jet going overhead. We found that, for instance, if we simply clapped our hands, the man would defecate standing there. He was psychologically destroyed by the constant heavy bombing.
Just 30 years separated Vietnam from the war that first experienced the full impact of strategic bombing. It was 1936 in the Spanish Civil War, and it was the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, which demonstrated the power of the bomber as a weapon of terror on civilian targets. On August 14, 1936, the Luftwaffe launched a series of air raids that would change the face of warfare. Spanish cities, held by the Republicans, were to be the testing ground for this new kind of offensive. Madrid, the first target. But the climax came 8 months later with the destruction of the undefended town of Guernica. More than 1,500 people were killed in the bombing. The air raid sent shockwaves round the world. A devastating and, it seemed, irresistible way of waging war had arrived. The Germans now unleashed another military revolution, Blitzkrieg, the lightning war. It integrated troops, tanks, and aircraft in one combined assault. Here was a new job for the bomber, to support the soldiers as they advanced. Enter the Stuka, a dive bomber, whose shriek could chill the bravest heart.
And in the Blitz war, troops must be moving. And the armed spearheads, if they run into an obstacle which they couldn't overcome, then the Air Force had to send a squadron or a group of Stukas. For this reason, in the first armed cars was always a Stuka pilot as a connection officer. And he was in radio contact with the leader of the Stuka group which attacked. By this contact, it was possible to drop bombs sometimes nearer than 100 meters in front of their own troops. I think you have to be cool to do it. And if you cannot be cool under these conditions, you might be a nice fellow, a good pilot otherwise, but not for this special job. When you start the dive, for a young fellow, the whole world belongs to you. It's really an amazing feeling. You dive with a speed of 450 kilometers, then you have to keep the aircraft straight, clean for 3 seconds. You have a horn, like in the car, that gives exactly the height where you pull out. And we have switched it, let's say, to 2,000 feet. And it yells, then first to drop the bomb and pull out. As you are level, of course, you apply full power because now you run for life.
As the German armies launched their invasions, Guernica was repeated across Europe. In one devastating air raid, the center of Rotterdam was flattened. 5 hours later, the Dutch government surrendered. It was the bomber's moment of triumph. It seemed now that nothing could stop it. All that lay between the conquering German armies and complete victory in Europe was Britain. Hitler gave Goering and his Luftwaffe a different job, to prepare the way for an invasion across the English Channel. What he needed now was not an air force in support of the army, but one that could seek out and destroy key strategic targets in Britain. The mainstay of this air assault was the bomber that had proved itself in Spain, the Heinkel 111. Small by later standards, it had a crew of 3. carried 2 tons of bombs and could fly a round trip of 500 miles. By the end of the war, over 6,500 of these aircraft had flown with the Luftwaffe.
Die 111 war für uns alle, für jede Besatzung, die...
The Heinkel 111 was for all of us, every crew that flew it, a kind of life insurance. The machine was reliable, good-tempered, was easy to fly. Anyone else in a Junkers 88, for example, or any other more complicated plane, would have had more worries than we did in a Heinkel 111. Everyone knew it was a serious business, and the tension increased the moment we reached the Channel coast. The nearer we got to the English mainland, the higher the tension became. No one spoke much. One simply said, right, 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 or left, left, left. Hold steady. Now I'm ready.
The Luftwaffe's assault on England began in July of 1940. Its first targets were the RAF's airfields. Its aim to deprive the British of their main line of defense against the bombers. But the German Air Force now faced a new experience. Far from their bases, they came up against defended targets. For the first time, bombers confronted the determined resistance of fighters. So the Battle of Britain began. The British now introduced a new defensive weapon into the battle: radar, a device which, by transmitting radio waves and picking up their echoes, could detect solid objects at a distance. With radar and other electronic developments, the British defenders could work out the location, numbers, and range of the approaching bombers. They could then scramble their fighters at the most effective moment. In daylight, the German bombers suffered enormous losses. By the summer's end, they had still not broken the British defenses. The bomber had received its first setback. So Goering changed the tactics. Now the Luftwaffe would raid by night. Darkness offered greater security to the vulnerable bombers, but darkness brought problems too. How do you find a blacked out target at night over a strange country? The Germans developed an electronic system of their own. 2 converging radio beams that told the pilot when he was over the target. But the British countered with a device which bent the beams.
Suddenly we couldn't hear the beam anymore, and when it came back, we found we were 17 degrees off course. We couldn't find Derby or our alternative target, so we decided to fly home. We dropped our bombs in the channel. Landing with bombs is no life insurance. And so the whole raid, as it is so beautifully put in airman's jargon, has gone down the trousers, was a washout.
On September 7th, the attacks on Britain's capital began. At its height, the Blitz raged for 76 nights, leaving death and destruction across the city. But it failed to break the people's spirit. The bomber had suffered another setback, as American correspondent Quentin Reynolds told the world.
From the clouds, hell was let loose. I saw the magnificent work of your grand firemen and ARP people All honor to them. As the flames roared, Londoners set their teeth and took it on the chin. But it wasn't a knockout. It gave birth to a grim determination that the Germans should pay dearly for such destruction.
Britain's only means of hitting back was to launch its own bomber offensive. The greatest advocate of this policy was Chief of the RAF's Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris.
The Nazis entered this war under the rather childish delusion that they were going to bomb everybody else and nobody was going to bomb them. At Rotterdam, London, Warsaw, and 100 other places, they put that rather naive theory into operation. They sowed the wind, and now they are going to reap the whirlwind.
The Lancaster was the British bomber that took the offensive back to the Third Reich. It had a crew of 6 or 7 and was armed with 8 guns. With a bomb load of 10 tons, its range of 1,500 miles was enough to fly deep into Germany and back. The RAF had learned from bloody experience how vulnerable lightly armed bombers were. So the Lancaster bristled with a formidable armory, designed to beat off the German fighters and batter through the German defenses. But beyond the protection of its short-range fighters, tough as the Lancaster was, it was still vulnerable.
We tried bombing in daylight, and it was impossible. You couldn't get through the fighter defenses. It was suicidal. We had to bomb at night. And the moment you bomb at night, you lost your accuracy. So there came the moment when either we stopped the offensive or went to area bombing.
Area bombing meant bombing whole cities rather than specific targets. After the war, this policy became controversial. But for the British people in their darkest hour, it was the only way to strike back. It was a fitting revenge for the Blitz. For the young air crews, flying bombing missions over Europe was a deadly, dangerous job. In the whole of the war, only German U-boat crews faced greater risk to their survival.
In something like 14 months, I don't suppose I saw more than about a dozen crews finish a tour and go off. So the expectation of life was not high. Now, to keep on in that knowledge, I always found to be quite extraordinary. We're losing up to 80 or sometimes 90 aircraft a night from the command. We had no means of knowing at that time what happened to aircraft and crews. They just disappeared. Some of them became prisoners. But as far as we were concerned, they'd gone.
On the wall there was a huge big map of Europe with a red ribbon going from your base to wherever the target was. And we all used to look, first of all, where the end of the red ribbon was. And if it was Berlin, we all used to say, oh my God, not again.
The thing which used to impress me about so many of these young pilots flying a 4-engine airplane, they couldn't drive a car because they weren't old enough to get a license when the war started. They could fly a bomber, but they couldn't drive a car.
You had your own ground crew. They attached themselves to you and you to them because you depended on them for your life. And they were all sensing that you were going out and they were behind. But you felt that you were all one because you did the same thing. You came together on that dispersal. And in the fading light, this was the last moment, possibly some of us would see them again. Every aircraft had its own smell. And I can smell it now, a mixture of high-octane fuel, hydraulic fluid, rubber, even the Elson giving off smell. It also, I think, a mixture of fear, you know, at the same time. You could see growing on the horizon this big cauldron of light with lights flashing, intense white light of the buildings burning, the splash of the incendiaries going down, the pinpoint of lights which was denoting bombs going off. and the constant flash of the anti-aircraft fire. So you're just sitting there like a big goose for the fighter to pick you off. The only feeling that you've got is you're in the herd and you hope somebody on the outside of the herd is going to get picked off and it's not you, so they might be satisfied.
If it's a blockbuster, you see a big red ball of fire, wells up and dies down. When you press the button, you get a feeling of elation. You feel, this is where you're getting home back. You're going to hit them.
You feel the bump as each bomb goes, and you just couldn't get those doors closed quick enough and go into a nose-down position where you've got extra speed and pulled away from the target. It was a great feeling to cross that coast, and you could see the friendly fields and hedges if it was coming dawn, and the familiar approaches to the airfield. It looked like Dante's Inferno with these long streamers of flame going up, and the smoke was coming off them, but it did create the heat in a misty atmosphere or foggy one to lift it that much that you could get in underneath it. You had that sinking feeling as you were approaching and you were holding the aircraft back and you're losing airspeed, and you got that moment of stillness before you hit the runway, and the first thing was the bump and the screech of the tires. I don't know whether the screech was the tires or everybody going, ah, you know, at the last minute, we're here.
In Germany, men and machines were mobilized to combat the bomber offensive. By early 1944, the Germans had night fighters that dominated the skies, causing terrible damage to the British squadrons. In one raid on Nuremberg, 108 bombers were shot down. Increasingly sophisticated radar installations, searchlights, flares, and over 30,000 anti-aircraft guns meant night no longer offered the bomber protection. The British offensive faltered. Only with Allied air supremacy over German skies would it resume its momentum. When America joined the war in Europe, it created new air forces to play their part in the bomber offensive against Germany. The American commanders put their faith in precision bombing with the inherent risk of daylight operations. To begin with, their air crews were quite unprepared for the sort of battle they were getting into. This is how one of their commanders, Curtis LeMay, saw it.
The pilots I had, they'd come right out of flying school and had about 200 hours on single-engine airplanes. The bombardiers I got 2 weeks before we went overseas. Navigators, half of them, the first time they saw an ocean, they navigated across it. The gunners had supposedly been to a gunnery school. They'd never shot a gun from an airplane. We never flew formation until we got to England. It was a complete debacle. They just couldn't do it.
The B-17. The Flying Fortress was the bomber the United States relied on to fly without fighter escort in daylight deep into the German heartland. It carried half the bomb load of a Lancaster and cruised at an altitude of 25,000 feet, but it was heavily armored and heavily armed with 11 machine guns.
The B-17 was a very strongly built airplane. It had the old DC-3 engine in it. It had 4 of them. That engine had been around a while, had been pretty thoroughly tested. And, you know, you had to take a direct hit in it to knock it out, or cut a fuel line or something of that kind. Now, the airplane was slightly underpowered, but it was a good engine. Easy to fly, very forgiving. It had a big, thick wing on it. I saw one torn off because the airplane was in steep dive, and the wind force tore it off. I never saw a wing blown off an airplane the whole war. These airplanes took lots of bullets and a lot of shrapnel and survived. We took a direct hit in the number 2 gas tank over Lille. It ended up with a hole that was probably 6 feet by 6 feet, completely through the wing. You could have dropped a desk completely through the wing of the airplane. The fire was so big, the tail gunner could not stay in the tail. It got so hot from the gasoline burning. And we couldn't feather the propeller. And yet we flew the airplane back and landed it with no trouble. We did not have enough guns on the airplane. We had a real problem in trying to defend ourselves in the sky. Even though we had the famous flying fort with a lot of machine guns, we didn't have enough. We learned right off, for instance, and the Germans learned this quickly, that we could not fire straight forward because the top turret guns could not come down below level, and the belly guns couldn't shoot up. So the front was open.
The Americans, like the Germans and British before them, suffered great casualties in the daylight. But they endured their losses until finally the arrival of Allied long-range fighters brought them the protection they needed.
All of the men on the air crews were volunteers. Nobody could be assigned flying duty. They had to volunteer first. Many of us might have changed our minds had we had better foresight and had anticipated the flak, the fighters, some of the tougher raids like Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich.
We never knew any of the crews. To us, they were just planes going by in the morning on a mission. And we'd go outside the hangar, watch them go by. Once in a while, wave to one of the pilots if he'd wave back. I know I was saying a prayer, and I'm pretty sure the rest of them were saying it. They didn't say they were. But if you talk to them today, they were saying, yes, we did.
Until they got their escorts, the American bombers needed a way to counter the German fighters. General Curtis LeMay introduced a new formation called the combat box. Bombers were stacked and staggered in such a way that almost every aircraft in the group was covered by the guns of every other airplane.
Flying at high altitude, particularly depending upon the humidity in the air, you would get contrails coming off the engine, the condensation of the exhaust. It was a beautiful sight to see, but it was a terrifying sight because it not only gave away your position to the gunners on the ground, but it also allowed the German fighters to fly up the contrail and attack you from the rear almost unannounced. Participated in one of the 1,000-plane raids and seen the number of airplanes in the sky at one time was just appalling. It was absolutely fantastic. There were planes all over the sky as far as you could see, wave after wave after wave of planes. The thing that, to some degree, I liken it to would be the movie The Birds. The inhabitants of the village looked up and the sky was black with birds. And I guess that's kind of what it looked like, literally a sky full of planes.
Anti-aircraft, it's scary looking. When the shells explode right near your aircraft, you can hear the fine shrapnel hitting the airplane. And it's just like hail on a tin roof. The next 3 shots is going to be right with you, maybe into Bombay. Seeing it explode, and they had different colors. They had red and green, and they had some purple. And that stuff is scary looking, and I was scared. No question about it. You see ACAC going off just outside your window. You don't see people on the ground. But somebody shot that ack-ack up there. So you really don't see people. You divorce yourself from it's what you do.
Well, it'd be a plane out there with an engine burning or something, and be 2 or 3 German fighters, they just come in on it and just riddle it to pieces. The German fighters would normally attack the full group. They didn't wait for cripples, but if there was a cripple in the area, he was really fair game.
B-17, right next to him, got a shell. First time I'd seen one go down. And it spun off to the left. And the parachutes began to come out of that thing. 1, 2, 3. You're counting. You're trying to count to 9. And everybody's counting, but you don't realize, you think you're the only guy counting. And as the parachutes came out, you count them off as safe, safe, safe.
You have to pay an admission price every time you go over there. You're going in enemy territory to destroy some of his resources. Now, he's going to try to prevent you. You're going to have some losses. If you're going to pay an admission price, you better get something for it. You better hit the target. Now, if you've missed the target and you have to go back again, the admission price is about double what you paid the first time. And this is what happened to us a lot of times.
11,000 American bombers flew against the Germans. Almost half failed to return.
Some of the planes that came back really shook the crews up in the hangar. We didn't know any of the men, but we more or less could feel what they'd gone through. What we didn't expect was to get into a plane and maybe have to clean up the blood of some poor pilot that got shot up, or find pieces of clothing. Once in a great while, you might find a little piece of a body. And probably it maybe affected us a little more because we didn't know who it was. If we'd have known the people in there, maybe we knew what the man was like or something like that. Maybe we could have got away with it that way, but this way, all we knew it was some American that had been in there.
All I can say is losing a friend was the hardest part of this war. And I've lost a few, I'll be honest with you, because we were really close. A combat crew couldn't be any closer than a husband and wife, and well, I just don't want to think about it, okay?
The price paid in the lives of the air crews for the Allied bomber offensive was enormous. The RAF lost more than 55,000 men, 1 in 7 of all British Empire deaths in action. American losses in the European theater were greater still, 94,000 men. The cost to Germany was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands dead and the ruin of all its major cities.
Because Hamburg It was just unbelievable, the amount of smoke, the amount of flame. We flew by Hamburg about 3 days after the major part of the raid, and the smoke trails were as far as you could see, and the fires were still burning. We had 3 targets in Hamburg and couldn't find any of them because of the smoke and the fire.
The day after the armistice, they allowed us to come down to 600 feet and just look. Ordinarily, on a mission, you're at 24,000 feet, you don't see much. But at 600 feet, it's different. The city was totally devastated. There were no streets. I mean, you couldn't find streets. And all the bricks and the buildings had just caved into the street. And it'll always remain in my mind.
You knew that the civilians couldn't survive. Then again, we weren't that concerned about them because they were the enemy.
So what did the bombing offensive in Europe achieve? Not as much as its champions at first thought it might. The bomber did not defeat Germany on its own. It did not break the morale of the German people. But it did divert resources to air defense from other hard-pressed fronts. It kept many of the Luftwaffe's fighters tied to their home bases. Perhaps most important of all, for a long period it was the only way the Western Allies had of hitting back at Germany. In the war in the Pacific, American bombers faced a different problem. Until 1944, Japan lay beyond their reach. It was too far, even from the airstrips hastily dug out of the desolate terrain of the Aleutians, the strip of islands stretching across the northern Pacific. But then came the capture of islands closer to Japan, like the Marianas, and at last a major bombing offensive could begin. Key to this air assault was a brand new bomber, the B-29, the Super Fortress. The biggest and most advanced bomber of the war, it was fast. Over 350 miles an hour, and with its pressurized cabin could fly at very great heights. It was well armed. It had 5 gun turrets, 2 on top of the fuselage, 2 on the bottom, and 1 in the rear. But above all, with its range of over 3,000 miles, here at last was a bomber that could hit Japan. At the start of the offensive, the Super Fortress used the same tactics employed in Europe. They flew unescorted by fighters. But cloud cover, common over Japan, obscured their targets and limited the damage they could inflict. Once again, losses were appalling. Each mission was losing 6% of its planes. Statistically, no air crew could expect to survive a tour of 25 sorties. Then General LeMay arrived from Europe. He ordered a change of tactics. Now it would be incendiaries instead of high explosives, lower level runs in place of high altitude raids. Within months, the new policy had paid off. First Tokyo in a devastating firestorm. Then other major Japanese cities were reduced to cinders and rubble. Soon the super fortresses could roam at will across the Japanese skies, systematically destroying the country's industrial base. By mid-1945, strategic bombing had brought Japan to its knees. Now it was a couple of B-29s that would deliver the knockout blow. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 named Enola Gay, after the captain's mother, took off from the Mariana Islands. Its target? Hiroshima. Its mission? To drop an atomic bomb. The explosion was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. It destroyed the city's center, killing 78,000 people immediately. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. It was the ultimate in terror bombing. 6 days later, Japan surrendered. For the United States Air Force chiefs, the lessons of the war were clear. Bombing worked, and now they had a monopoly of nuclear weapons. They also had another new bomber, one that could take off from America and reach targets a continent away. The B-36, a monster of an airplane with 6-piston and 4-jet engines.
Prove this is engineer. Pressurized. You don't smell the gas fumes. It's okay to smoke.
Inside the aircraft, there was comfort and space undreamed of by the air crews of World War II. Here was a unique opportunity. The air chiefs seized it. They set up an independent bomber force, SAC, the Strategic Air Command. General LeMay was put in charge of this new air force, whose job was to deter aggression with the threat of mass destruction. But the general was not happy with the state of his new command, so he put it to the test under wartime conditions.
Not one airplane in the Strategic Air Command finished its mission as briefed. They had absolutely no combat capability. Zero.
So LeMay developed the concept of a peacetime air force on a wartime footing. Its bombers armed and ready for action at all times.
Brakes are set. Battery on. Interphone's on. Stand by to start end. Clear left. Hit him.
The bomber that carries out this mission for the Strategic Air Command is the B-52, a plane that has already had an operational life of over 30 years.
The B-52 has been around for a long time. It was a magnificent airplane back in the 50s when it came out. We were in awe of it. I think we're a little less in awe of it, but it's still a magnificent airplane.
The first time I walked up to one, it did seem almost too big to fly. I have to admit that there are times during flight I look out at the wings when we're just cruising along, and I really do wonder what keeps it up there.
Over the years, we've shored up the wings, we've improved its engines, we have improved its avionics capability immeasurably. We have kept it flying, and it's served us well.
The B-52 was the airplane that dropped the first hydrogen bomb on Bikini Atoll in 1956. Its only active service was in Vietnam. Here it came up against defended targets. Even with the United States in control of the skies, this bomber, like its predecessors, was found to be vulnerable. The new threat was missiles.
When we started using it in and around Hanoi in December of 1972, we had to accept some losses. And that, of course, showed to us that at high altitude, in a surface-to-air missile defended area, that we were going to be taking some hits or some losses and losing some aircraft.
That's why this has been built, the B-1. The U.S. Air Force's answer to the challenge to find a bomber that can penetrate the enemy's defenses. It's the most expensive bomber ever produced. Expensive because of its state-of-the-art avionics. 2 tons of electronics to jam the enemy's radar, yet more to find the target. No wonder 2 of its 4 crew members are electronic systems operators. 8 nuclear missiles or 84 conventional bombs are its payload. Its shape is especially designed to reduce its visibility to radar. It can fly 600 miles an hour, 200 feet above the ground. The ultimate strategic bomber. It has a daunting and difficult task, even if all its sophisticated electronics work. Many people, remembering previous bombers, think it can't be done. That is why the Strategic Air Command is holding on to its B-52s till the end of the century. The bomber has changed the face of war. It has made every street and village a front line. It has wrought mass destruction on an unparalleled scale. It has not, despite the claims of its early champions, won wars on its own. But so awesome is its power, it remains a most formidable weapon to have on your side.